here we all are. And they just don't even know what they're missing.
Damn right.
So I write, but I don't do videos and slides and all that jazz. The good news is I have a grandson who's 13. So starting next week and at my workshop and my trusty iPad, I'm going to record me video, and I have a diva light for all of you ladies that care how you look. It's going to make me look like I'm 22 again. And so then I'm going to send this video to my grandson, who's going to make me even more beautiful, so I can start sharing these pearls of mine with the world.
It's called Photoshop.
I don't do Photoshop.
Your grandson.
So, I'll just give you a little bit of my journey and why I'm here today. I started out a high school dropout, and I wanted to be a doctor, but they said, no, you can't be a doctor. I was 8 at the time because you're a girl. And girls can't be doctors, but my mother had a female doctor, and my father said, well, yeah, but she lives with her mother. So, end of discussion, so I was 8. Then we moved, and we got another female doctor, my mother did, and I said, see, Dr. Z is married, and she's a doctor. He said, yeah, but she's, and has children. Yeah, but she's a lousy mother. So that was that, and this and this and that and that and that happened. And I grew up in Canada, and at the time, you were supposed to marry your high school sweetheart and live happily ever after. And so I had a boyfriend who was 4 years older than I, and I dropped out of high school, and then we got married, and in 7 years he had a 5-year engineering degree, a 2-year MBA, and a PhD, the first of its kind in industrial engineering applied to hospitals. So he was a really stupid person. And I was a high school dropout. And back in those days, I was with the faculty women's club, who was at University of Michigan. And the way the ladies introduced themselves was, I am Mrs. Dr. Professor Jones, and I graduated with a master's degree from Barnard. There was little me, a high school dropout. So I didn't tell anybody, but I was driving down the street, and there was this older house with a thing on it in Ann Arbor saying counseling center, so I went in. If we could have your attention, please, thank you. So I talked to this guy, and he said, well, why do you really want a GED? Don't you want to go to school? And I said, well, yeah, but. And he said, what are you doing for the rest of the day? And I said, well, I have a babysitter. And he said, well, we have this test, it's pretty long. Most people don't know about it, so I stayed and I took the test, and I scored in the 99th percentile. That wasn't in math, but since I was a girl, they didn't care. So he picked up the phone and called admissions at U of M and said, send this lady a letter. So there I was at the University of Michigan. That was pretty exciting, but then this famous husband of mine couldn't keep his zipper zipped, and I didn't think much of that, so we parted company, and that then began my journey. I thought I was going to be a psychologist, but I found that all these injunctions about what I couldn't do were also there for psychology. So I decided I would be a theater major because my mother didn't know how to stop me from doing that. So I went on and I went to school at Michigan with such notables as Gilda Radner and many people who you see on TV all the time. But the divorce happened, so then I was living in poverty, so I started studying this and studying that just on the side, and then I enrolled in an institute for Gestalt therapy and transactional analysis. And then my second husband was working for Chrysler, and Chrysler was going to die. And so he decided that he would move to California instead of getting laid off. So I moved to California and I found a place called the Healing Light Center, and wonder of wonders, I had found some place where I felt like I could be. And the whole emphasis was on the study of the world's ancient religions and consciousness. So I started out being a hands-on healer, and then I stayed, did the necessary whatever to become an ordained minister, and then I got a degree, and I thought, wow, if I can do this, I can get a real degree. So I went to Cal State, and I got 2 degrees undergraduate, one in theater and one in psychology. And I did pretty well, like I got all A's. And so one of my professors talked me into staying on, so I got a master's degree. I decided on Friday, sort of like I'm doing today, to take the GRE. I went the next morning to take it, but I guess I did all right. So there I was. And so of course, in the field of psychology, they don't want to know about consciousness. If you're seeing things, it's called schizophrenia. So I learned to, well, I've never learned to keep that up. So anyway, so I learned all those things, all these labels that people are given. And I met all kinds of fascinating people. One guy he came and he said, he said, I just really have to work this out. I killed somebody. I was a murderer for hire, and now I'm going to have a baby. So that was one of my interesting cases. And so it was, I worked then, and I went on for a doctorate right after my master's degree in a school called, I don't know if I can remember, the California Graduate Institute. So I was in a PhD program, and part of my internship, I worked at a place called the Body Mind, whatever it was, something or another. But so we were all very linear. Everything was linear. And of course, quantum, all these other people over there were starting to talk about quantum mechanics and things all happening at the same time, but I never believed that things don't happen all together, but that was where my brain was taught. And so, anyway, I had to drop out for well, I guess I dropped out because I got divorced again. And so there I was. So my father died, my mother died, and I felt bad, and I moved back from California back to Michigan. And so that's where I am today. And I still am not a doctor. What on earth am I going to do? So I started at a school in Michigan, and I won't even say anything about it because none of what I would say would be nice, and we'll just leave it at that. And there's a very well-known astrologer whose name escapes me, but anybody who knows anything about astrology would know his name. And I wrote to him. I had seen him talk, I didn't know him. I said, what should I do? And he said, go to CIIS. And so I did, and Leslie was on my committee, and we've just really had a very tight bond ever since. And I spoke here 2 years ago about my dissertation and what I was talking about. And I have some handouts here if anybody's interested. And this is a talk I gave a couple of years ago. I'll have Steve post this or whatever people think anybody wants it. And it has a link to my dissertation also. So I knew that it's on my website. It's lizjelinek.com, so I can, anybody who wants to contact me, I can send it to you. So I knew, I didn't believe Bill, not for 1 minute. Not that I thought he was wrong, I just thought he didn't go far enough. When he said there are all these universal archetypes, I knew that my archetypes were a whole lot more than just that. And I knew that I grew up in Toronto, and back in those days, Catholics didn't go to the public school. They had their own public school that they paid their taxes there. So I went to school with only Jewish and Protestant. But there are two kinds of Protestants if you're from Ireland. And one is Anglican and the other is Presbyterian. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So I better tell you that now. So my father and mother were born in the north of Ireland. When they were born, it was all one Ireland. And it was, you were either Protestant, Catholic, or Church of Ireland. And the Church of Ireland, were, that's really the landed gentry. And
Church of England.
Church of England, but in Ireland it's called the Church of Ireland. But it is the Church of England, to be sure. So there were rules about who could do what. I couldn't tap dance because only Catholics tap dance. I couldn't do ballet because only Anglicans could do ballet. So I could do Irish, the Irish jig, but I couldn't do the clogging because that was too Catholic. And my father was a devout atheist. So there's my mom, this wishy-washy Presbyterian, and my father was a devout, passionate atheist. So my mother didn't go to church, and my grandmother who lived with us didn't go to church, but I went to Sunday school every Sunday, dragging my little sister along with me, and then I came home. And my father did his sermon. He was a really good preacher for 2 to 3 hours every week with us on religion is the opiate of the masses and the poor working man and Karl Marx and the war in Spain. And I'm like, and I said, these people are nuts. So what happened was I started thinking really, really early in my life, because the dissonance was just, it was paradoxical. I mean, so I learned to live with paradox because they were both perfectly nice people. So I knew that this ancestry of mine had something to do with who I was. I certainly knew that it impacted my mind and how I thought, and I suspected that maybe my body, but I wasn't there quite yet. But I had learned at the Healing Light Center that you can heal your body, you can connect to your body, and that thoughts are things, and if you think good thoughts, you don't have to die of cancer. So I went back to find a way to design this form of therapy that I could teach to other psychologists that included the ancestors. So I was back, Leslie, oh, well, you know how he's this great communicator, so he sent around an email to us all who were students there, And it was about this thing called family constellations that another one of his students had gotten through, got a PhD through Sabre, and Leslie was on his committee. Well, doggone it, Bert Hellinger had already done this, created this form of therapy. But then I thought, well, gee, this is easy. So I started out to study about family constellations. And so I was 5 minutes after I got that email, I called Andrew Cohen, he lives here in Boston area, and I was in Germany 2 weeks later with no way to pay for this $1,200 week-long course that I was going to take. But I remembered prosperity consciousness and not poverty consciousness. So anyway, fascinatingly enough, it was all paid within less than 3 weeks after I got home. I believed, and the universe came through. So here I am now. There's not a whole lot going on in the States, except in Connecticut, about family constellations, but there's book after book after book written by all these German people, because Hellinger was German, well, he's still alive, and he's still teaching at 92 or 93. And I thought, well, the theory was that you can become entangled with the fate of the ancestors, okay? And so there were various explanations. Rupert Sheldrake, well, he didn't talk about constellation, but the whole thing about morphic fields and morphic resonance. And I really was attracted. In fact, when he was here teaching, I talked to him, and he was really helpful and encouraging. But by then, he was becoming bigger, and I didn't want to go there because I did not include him, but he wasn't this non-local thing. I wanted my own. And there was a Native American woman who's very famous in the field, Francesca Mason-Boring. And she is an American, and so, she had her non-local. And what a guy by the name of Albert Mar in Germany, he was a German psychiatrist, one of the very early on people, and he called it the knowing field. So the knowing field is what carried the information from the ancestors to the people in the present. And the hypothesis always has been that it didn't matter whether it was physical or whether it was emotional or whatever, it just was carried by this knowing field. He never went into saying what it was. So, gosh, I got to figure out a way to talk about this non-local communication that's unique. And what did I find? I found science. And I found the science of epigenetics. And that's what's on my handout. And so I did a really very, very comprehensive survey of the literature in epigenetics. And because of the nature of constellations, I was looking for ways to describe trauma, but that's where people who started working with epigenetics talked about people, because it was so obvious in people, like the Holocaust survivors, the children of Holocaust survivors. And in fact, I had one of those in my office who'd been in therapy for, well, she was like 66 when she came to me. And she started in therapy when she was 15 and just was still. And I, after a bit, I said, oh my gosh, she has PTSD. And she did. Happy to say she no longer manifests it. So I came here and I talked about all this stuff that we carry. And what you complain about, if anything is off from center, you complain about, my mother gave me this, my father gave me that, or if you don't, somebody does it, you go to the, it's in your genes, and so on, blah, blah, blah. So I talked about the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And there was one guy, and I don't remember who it was, but it was one of the regulars in Leslie's group, and he said, well, does this do anything good? Well, I knew that it did because I'd come across that. And there was a, you know, in the section in the dissertation when you say, well, what I would do next would be, and some of you may have heard of him, Ernest Rossi. He's a psychologist, and he was a colleague or a follower of Milton Erickson. And so he was one of the earliest psychologists to talk about epigenetics. And what he wrote, I don't know where I found it. Anyway, I'd always liked him, and I've got a certificate in Milton Erickson, blah, 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 hypnotherapy and so on. So, it turns out, or so Rossi claimed, that a peak experience, I'll talk about that for a minute, can and does grow new neuronal pathways in the brain. So I'm thinking, as I'm preparing to come here, of this guy who went back the second time and the other day finally made it to the top of Mount Everest without any oxygen. Now that's a peak experience. And one of the gentlemen who's here, whom I know from the constellations community, he and I were talking, and I have known him off and on. We're not friends or anything, but we're colleagues. And I know some of his issues, and I know how well he's doing with his issues, and he's studying at the Graduate Institute. And his eyes were sparkling because this is just there for you guys. It's just there. It's available. I knew it, what, how many years ago? I don't know how many years ago. But what I looked for when I was working with healing was, if you came to me with cancer, the question was, what brings you joy? So remember that. Any of you who are starting to feel old and ill, you don't know what brings you joy, or you've given it up, or you're not entitled, or it's too hard. That might be too challenging. But a peak experience, holy moly, anybody can do that. You can go to Magic Mountain, you can go to Disneyland, you can go wherever you want. Well, Disneyland, maybe I don't know about that, but there's always something that's why people bungee jump. They don't know they're growing their brain. That's why people climb mountains. They don't know they're growing their brain. And in my opinion, I haven't seen this documented anywhere in the literature, but I was just sharing with James. People get mindsets. And if people can change their mindsets, this client came to me 4 years ago, asking me to get him committed to a memory unit. He thought that was the only reasonable way to spend the rest of his life. And 4 years later, he does have a license back. He does have a decent income, but he's a mere shadow of a man still. He actually smiles sometimes. But this morning, I was so excited when James was talking, because this guy told me, just randomly, you know, when I'm brushing my teeth in a hotel, I see myself brushing my teeth in the mirror at home. So I already knew that this guy was split. And not split in the sense of schizophrenia, but what happens with trauma survivors is they split off from the trauma. And there is documentation in the literature about that, okay? So this guy was so not here that he had almost zero frontal lobe activity in his brain. Almost zero. Hold on just one second. 5 minutes. So almost no frontal activity in his brain. And I'm remembering, the saying we've done constellations. And in constellations, the first thing that he does is he pulls out because he doesn't want to be there. So the other day, just out of nowhere, I said, cover your eyes. We had had a conversation about why that he needed to learn to communicate because everybody was always getting him wrong. And I had this moment of clarity after I got the email. Holy moly, what he doesn't know how to do is to listen. So he had never heard what anyone says to him. And he married a woman who was uber dominant, so he never had to do it all by him. He just followed her like a little puppy. Well, I don't do puppy dogs like that. Anyway, so epigenetics is unbelievably exciting. So change your life, change your diet, change your house, take a vacation, go bungee jumping, climb a mountain. Anything that is going to fill you with wonder. And the other day after that, I did a constellation with just him in my office. And I used little people, play with little figures. And as he began to get all nervous and so on, at the end, it was like this to his story. And I said, it's okay to take a walk, and he came back and he said, I feel blissful. I've never felt this before. And so there you are, folks. It's there for all of you. I love to communicate. I love helping people. I do have a distance coaching business, so anybody who wants to contact me, feel free. I should have stopped in time to have you ask questions, but I will be at the Graduate Institute this evening, so if you have any questions, or email me. And I don't think I brought enough of the papers, but I'll have Steve put them on. Did you get one, Steve? The handouts?
I will, yeah.
Oh, you know what to know.
Okay.
Great. So that's it, folks.